Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to day 4 of the Django Bootcamp. This is the agenda that you see here. No surprises. We're going to do a quick little overview of what we're talking about, and then we're going to jump into the code. Now, the concept that we're talking about today is pretty vast. It's actually a really important concept, so there are things that I probably am not going to be able to get to within an hour, but I will do my best to get there. And of course, if you have questions and all that, please let me know. So let's go ahead and jump into it. First, I just wanted to recap what we did last time, which simply was we can now accept any URL and we can parse that URL to a view. And inside of that view, we can render a template, or we can get some data from a model, or both things, and then bring that into a HTML page with just plain HTML or with all this contextual things as well. So pretty simple. So now what we want to do is actually talk about one step further, which is having a user send us some sort of data. And that data that they're going to send is, well, it's going to actually go through the same process. It's going to go to the URL. It's going to be sent to a view of some kind. That view is going to handle whatever that data is. That's why I kind of skipped these other pieces. It just pretty much that data part goes directly to a view. And in that view, it's going to decide whether or not it's going to be sending it to a model and saving the model, or updating the model, or deleting the model. And then it's actually going to be able to be rendered in a template as well. So it's kind of a dual purpose thing. So now what I want to talk about is, of course, this, right? So I always want to show you guys this because I've been teasing it for a while. Query parameters, these actual parameters, we will take a look at these things today in real time, in real action, with respect to what's going on here. So I want to mention a few things that are common across all web applications, every single web application, and it's called HTTP methods. So typically speaking, when you're going to a URL of any kind, that is called an HTTP GET method. So GET method itself. There's another method that is called POST, which typically means like you post some data. Think of it kind of like a mail, like a physical mail, right? So when you're sending out post or an actual letter, you're posting it somewhere, right? So you want to think of those things in terms of, one is actually grabbing some data, which is called GET, like getting data. The other one is called POST, as in sending data. Put and delete work very similar, but I'm actually not going to be covering those at this point. So that's because I really want to focus on the two methods that are really relevant to Django, and specifically Django views. Put and delete are certainly relevant. I shouldn't downplay those at all. But in our case, we really want to focus in on these two because these two are the ones you'll probably use the most. So oftentimes you'll see post methods to update data as well. You don't actually have to use a put method to update data. And if that's confusing at all, no worries. But this is generally what's happening here. So you've got these 4 different HTTP methods, and what they can do is they can create, retrieve, update, destroy things in your database. That's often what you're kind of doing with these HTTP methods is, hey, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish using this method? And often with a post method, you're trying to create data in the database. With a GET method, you're trying to retrieve data, whether it's from a database or just from a template or a view. But either way, you're trying to retrieve data. You're trying to get whatever that data is. And again, you can use post to update and destroy, as well as put and delete. Now, these methods are just common practice. You can actually technically handle these methods however you want to. Now, I say technically because that doesn't mean you should do it. And that's going to be one of those themes that we're going to talk about. Let's actually see how these methods apply inside a Django view. So again, we're focusing on post and get. So every view has the request coming in by default. We'll take a look at this in a code in just a second, but every request, you can actually call an HTTP method on that request using dot notation, as you see here. And with that request, so request.post or request.get, you might get a dictionary of data. So this is a Python dictionary of data, typically speaking, or at least how we're handling it. But it can be other kinds of data. It can be JSON data. It can be XML data. There is other ways to actually send this kind of data through. But that gets into a whole nother area that we just don't really need to cover to understand what's going on with Django and how it actually handles or ingests data. So these first two, request post and request get, those ones are actually showing us how to grab the data that's coming in by default. Request get is actually directly correlated to those query parameters here. We'll see that in a moment as well. But just to keep in mind that also in your view, there's request.method, and that will give you the HTTP method that is actually being used inside of that view. And that will give you a true false value depending on what it is. And here's actually what that looks like in an actual view itself, right? So of course, these are function-based views. And what this is important for is so that we can see or designate different handlers or different control flow depending on what's coming through. And that's something that we'll definitely be focusing on in this one. So, and here's kind of the lay of the land of how Django's sort of handling this. We've got a URL, so a user goes to that URL and they get back a template. That template itself, or the view itself, can actually enrich a template with a form. So the template now has a form that's going to be rendered. That renders out to a page. That user can interact with that page and then send that data back into that view, which again is going to be mapped because of the URL. But it sends it back into that view. That view can handle what's ever happening in that form, and then it actually can send back some sort of response to the user again. So you don't obviously have to have forms inside of a view, but it is actually a really, really important thing to understand that your forms are going to live on the view, and you can do all sorts of really cool things as a result of what happens with those forms. And that includes updating a Django model, right? I actually don't have it directly correlated because the view is going to orchestrate how it would update with a Django model. The form itself doesn't have to do that for all sorts of reasons, which we'll hopefully get into. So here's kind of the mantra of forms, and actually working with request methods and data that's being sent from a user to your backend, right? So working is not equal to working well, right? But as a beginner, you just want to get it working, right? Over time, you'll start to get it to working well. And that's also true about working securely and efficiently or effectively. But all of those things are always true. So just remember that as a beginner, especially the security part or securely, that is an ongoing battle, right? So even if it's working securely today, doesn't mean it's going to work securely in the future. And this is actually critical to one of the bad practices that you could potentially do with these query parameters and with a get method, which I actually am going to show you right now. So let's go ahead and actually jump in to the code and talk about the very first thing, which would be a bad method. We're going to do some bad stuff first, although it will technically work. Okay, so I'm in my project now. Notice that I don't have anything opened. So what I want to do is go into a view, and I'm going to go ahead and handle some sort of view here. I'm going to make this a bad view. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do request, args, keyword args, and then I'm going to return HTTP response, don't do this. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to get the request get. So if we do request.get, I want to know what that data is. So since I created this view, let's actually bring it into our URLs. And here we go. And I'll go ahead and say bad view don't use. Okay, here we go. So now we've got bad view don't use. So let's go ahead and open up this project in our server, right? So I got to activate my virtual environment, source bin/activate, python manage.py, and run server. No surprises here, I think. Okay, so I'm now opening up this view. Now, of course, my index page, my main home page, doesn't actually have a view at all, but I will open up the bad view don't use here. Okay, so don't do this. Now, what I did was inside of that view, I actually printed out something. So this query dictionary is literally a Python dictionary. So we can actually treat it as a dictionary. So if I actually call dict around this and save that, and then rerun this page, I actually get an empty dictionary. So going back to those query parameters, if we look at this URL here, I can actually say new product equaling to true, and then we'll go ahead and say and. So the and sign, which will allow you to actually chain together additional key value pairs. And I'll say title equals to don't, and content equals to, so let me move that over to this is not great, but it works. Maybe I put some spaces in there too. Okay, and now that I've got a few different query parameters, so keyword arguments, key value pairs, so we've got our keyword and our value, after that equal sign, and now I'm going to go ahead and hit enter here. Notice that my actual browser does some, more proper browsing and actually replaces the spaces with what should be there, which is %20. So those are treated as spaces, but now it's a URL encoded string is the point there. But after I printed all that out, take a look here. So now I actually have data coming through. So this data can be used for all sorts of things. What I can do is I can come in here and say new product equals to request.get using capital get and now lowercase get. Now the reason I can do lowercase get is because, again, my request data is essentially a dictionary, right? So on dictionaries, you can do .get. You could also use a bracket, but if that item doesn't exist, as you may know, it's going to fail, right? It's going to actually raise an exception, and we don't want to raise exceptions on accident. Okay, so now we've got this new product here, and I'll go ahead and say if new product.lower equals to true. Now, why am I using .lower when it says true with a capital? But if you notice, it's actually a string itself, right? So I'm going to go ahead and then print out new product. I'm also going to print out this data again. So print our requested data and new product. Okay. So hopefully you see kind of where I'm going here. Maybe not, but oops. So it says list item does not have an attribute lower. That's because of how this data came through, right? So it came through as a list item, which is actually a default with this request get. So all I need to do here is just put the first item in there. And I mean, that was actually pretty obvious as to what's going on here. So we save that and let's run that again. And if I scroll down a little bit, I see that it says new product, right? So I actually have the new product here, and then I have all these key value pairs, right? So I can actually repeat this process and create a product.objects.create something, right? So the something being, request, the title being like request.data.get and title. And again, we would probably use the first item there, right? And then we could do that same thing for content and my request.data.get content. And again, 0. Okay, so we save that, refresh in here, and let's actually jump into the admin. And you know what we're going to see? There we go. Title, don't. This is not great, but it works. Right? Okay, so this is actually an example of, hey, it works. It seems to work well, but it's really, really bad. There's several reasons for this. One of them being, this is just an open URL. Right, so anybody could do this and run it over and over again. It's actually really prone for mistakes, and some sort of hacking is going to happen with this. Now, I wanted to show you this because it goes back to that idea that just because it works technically doesn't mean you should do it. Now, so let's actually bring this back and change our home view now to being called search view and see actually when we would want to use those query parameters. So in this home view, I'm going to just change the names of all these things to being search view. I'm going to get rid of that bad view. I really do not want to use it. So I'm going to comment it out completely. And so now what I want to do is actually provide some sort of search value. So what I'll say here is query equals to request.get, capital G, .get of Q, Q is often referred to as query. And then I'm going to actually query this search view now, and I'll just add it into my context. I'm not actually going to perform the query, but I'll show you how you would do it. So projects or product.objects.filter, let's say title I contains equals to query of 0. Okay, so this is a little bit more advanced. At some point we'll probably talk about it, but this is just another way to kind of narrow down any sort of filter. So we've got this query set here. So this should actually allow me to see what's going on with this query. So I'm going to go ahead and print out that query set. And let's go ahead and take a look at that now, going back into search and then adding a question mark. Let's zoom in here, question mark Q equals to this is my search. Hit enter. And I have no errors on the view itself. If I open up here, I'm getting a query set of... well, I'm actually getting query sets that contains that query itself. So let's actually print out what that query is, because that's probably not accurate here. So let's try that again. Yeah, so it's actually giving me some sort of match. I'm not 100% sure why at this point, which we'll talk about some other time. But the general idea here is now we've got a query coming through with this data. So this is an okay method because we're not actually changing the database at all. Where up here, we actually were changing the database based off of a request get method. So what do we need to do then? Like, how do we actually send data safely in creating some sort of database entry? Well, we can start with creating a view called, well, let's call this product create view. And it's going to take a request. And that's pretty much all we need, but we'll go ahead and say args and keyword args. Now what we're going to do is actually return another kind of page, and I'm going to call this forms.html. So of course I need to actually create that page. So inside of forms.html, what we're going to do is actually create a generic HTML form. So it's going to be forms.html, and just like home and all these other things, I'm going to go ahead and extend from base and then put my block content in here. So now what I'm going to do is actually do form, and I'm going to declare the method of post. Now by default, if you do not declare the method of post, it's going to use the method of get. And I'm also going to set an action. So this is the URL you want to send it to. If you just use a period here, it's going to send it to whatever URL is rendering out this form. If you need to send it somewhere else, you can say send to this URL. And using the slash at the beginning will actually do a relative path to wherever this is. Okay, so let's go ahead and get rid of that. And just use a period, and I'm going to go ahead and do input type equals to text, and we'll give it a name of something. And there we go. Okay, so I'll also add a button in here, so we'll go ahead and do button type equals to submit, and then I'll go ahead and say send data. Cool. Very simple, not a whole lot going on here, but the biggest thing here is we have a raw HTML form with the post method. Okay, so back in our view, we are rendering that thing out. So I'm going to go ahead and actually print out request.post. I'm also going to print out request.get. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring this into our URLs now. So our product create view. All right. And so I'm going to add a path here right above products, and I'll do create. There we go. So one of the things that maybe is going off in your head, wait a minute, these are almost the same kind of paths. Maybe you don't realize this, but I want to point it out because this right here says create. It is definitely not an integer. If I actually used 1 here, this would be a really bad pattern to create because I have a wildcard matching pattern. So I want to actually make it very specific to this as create. There's a lot of methods to handle this, but I just wanted you to be aware of it in case you did something like an str here or some other kind of lookup or capturing method for that URL. So another option would be just to do products-create, right? That actually solves a lot of problems when it comes to capturing wildcard URLs. Anyways, so now that we've got this product create view, let's actually go there. So we got products and create, and I've got context is not defined. Little mistake on my view. Now, I already knew this because I use context as the keyword argument all the time. Of course, if you needed to figure it out yourself, you would see that it says it right here, and it's in line 30, and then context, yeah, I never defined it. I can leave that as an empty dictionary for now. So let's refresh in here, and what do you know? I actually have a form, and if I say ABC and hit send data, I get a forbidden call. The CSRF token or verification failed. Okay, so this is one of those security measures that's built into Django that you don't need to add. It's one of those batteries included things that is absolutely important. And it also should highlight why the get method, what I did before, that bad view, is bad. It doesn't have this CSRF verification. So CSRF stands for cross-site request forgery. So in other words, we want to make sure that other sites aren't messing up ours, right? So we want to have these CSRF tokens to prevent those things from happening. Malicious actors doing things, I mean, in some cases, not purposefully. Sometimes it's an accident, but other times it's not. So we want to protect against whatever it is, right? And this is actually really simple to solve on our view. We go into forms and we actually use a CSRF underscore token. This filter tag is built into Django as well, and that will actually render out something for us. We'll take a look at that in a moment. The where that's actually coming from is inside of our settings. In our template tags, we actually have our authentication here and our request context processor. Both of those things provide additional security for this, but what we also have is this middleware. And I've mentioned middleware before, and I'll discuss it in a moment, but we also see that there's this CSRF view middleware. So if any package ever tells you, get rid of this CSRF view middleware, they are probably doing something shady. So don't actually do that. You absolutely want to use this. And also, if you ever see something like CSRF exempt, you really want to know why you are using something called CSRF exempt. That's just a word of warning for the future of your Django progress. Okay, so let's go back to this and actually send that data and take a look at that data. So I'm going to open up the terminal again and refresh in here. I'm actually not going to refresh. I need to go back to this page itself, and I'll go ahead and say ABC, and I'll send that data. And what we see here is two dictionaries. The first dictionary is actually coming from request post. The second one is coming from request get. So you can actually have get data in here as well. So query being ABC, we hit enter, and it shows me that I do have that data coming in here. But if I actually try to send that data again, it actually changes the URL page. You're like, wait a minute. This changed up here. I didn't actually navigate anywhere, but it did change. That all has to do with this action right here, right? So this action is making that thing change. It's going to the root of that URL, which gets rid of all of those query parameters, which is just another security feature that you don't accidentally want to get those query parameters. Okay, so now the other part of this is we see there's a CSRF token middleware token. There's a CSRF middleware token, which is this right here, right? So that is that security feature. Django is making sure that this is a good request, and you can actually go ahead and handle this data. Now, that doesn't always mean that this data is going to be good. There are things to ensure that this data is good and it's actually from a user, right? So that's not something we're doing just yet. We're just generally grabbing some data. So you don't want to grab data from everybody, obviously. Okay, so now that we've got this, let's actually handle this data now. Okay, so coming in here, I can now say if request.method equals to post, and this is actually where I can handle that data itself. So let's say post data equals to request.post, or I can leave it in as an empty dictionary, or I can say none. And now I'll go ahead and say if post data is not equal to none, then I'll go ahead and just print out that post data. Okay, so I'll comment out these things right here, and I'll even add a little string in here to make sure that, yeah, that is the post data that's coming through. And I'll go ahead and send that through. And what we got here is that post data. Okay, so this is actually not the method I want to go about doing things. There's something built into Django that handles post data. It handles form data. Not only does it render a form for you, but it also handles the post data itself. So before we actually render the form, I will actually improve this form by, well, creating a Django form. So let's go ahead into products. I'm going to make a new file here called forms.py. Now this isn't in there by default because you won't always need to use forms for your models or for your apps. Just food for thought. So we'll go ahead and do from Django import forms. Now I'm going to go ahead and do a class, and we'll call this product form, and it's forms.form, right? So this is actually works very similarly to a model itself. Each form has some sort of field. So let's go ahead and do title equals to forms.char field or character field or car field, and that's it. So that's the only thing I'm going to be doing on this form at this point. So go ahead and copy this. Now, remembering back to the actual discussion earlier on how all of this is working, is what we've done so far is we have a user being able to submit some data that went into our view, right? So inside of our view, we actually want to send it to this form. This actually can send stuff back to that view as well, right? So the form itself doesn't actually, elude the view. There should be another arrow in here, but let's go ahead and actually bring this into a view now. So inside of our product create view, I'm now going to go ahead and do from.forms, import the product form, and come down into our create view, and I'm going to grab that post data. So I'll go ahead and say my form equals to that product form, and in here I'm going to go ahead and say request.post. So I can actually pass in that request post data into my form, and then I can print out my form.isValid. Okay. Don't worry, we'll discuss what all that means in a moment. So we'll go ahead and save that, and let's go ahead and actually send that data through. I want to just re-navigate to this page, and it looks like I have some errors. So we've got cannot import product form from products.forms. Maybe I didn't save everything. Let's make sure we save everything. It's something that I don't mention all the time, but it's definitely something I absolutely have to do all the time. Okay, so here we are. We're back into products create. So I'm going to go ahead and say ABC. I'll send that data. This page doesn't show me much. And actually, old web pages used to do this all the time. I mean, actually, still today, that happens too, where it's not telling you if it was successful or if it's an error. So that's, of course, something we want to cover. So what I see here is false in this post data with the data dictionary as we sort of expect. So what it's telling me is this form right here is actually incorrect. It's not actually valid data. Now, this is because of how I named things. So inside of the form, the field I'm looking for here is title. That's the name of the field that this form is looking for. So when I say field, I mean actual input in the form itself. So right here, we've got input type of text. That's fine. We've got a name here saying something. That is an incorrect name. It actually should match what's with this form if we want this form to actually handle this data, which we do. But of course, it's not the only way. Like many things in programming, there's a lot of ways to handle form data. But with Django, the built-in forms is really, really nice. So let's actually change this to title. This name is fairly arbitrary, right? So I made it up, obviously, but you don't actually have to stick with any particular name here. Just keep in mind that whatever you name this, your actual form has to be named that as well. So we're going to go ahead and save that, and we'll come back into this create method here, and I'm going to go ahead and say ABC. Now when I hit send and I look back into my print statement, I now have a true, as in this data is valid, right? So this is a valid form. Cool. So now that we have this valid form, I can actually also use that data. So we're going to go ahead and say, let's come in here and say if my form.isValid. We don't need that print statement anymore. But now if it's valid, that's when I'm actually going to do the printing. So I'm going to tab this in, and I'll print out my form.cleaned data get in the field name I want to get. In this case, I only have one field name, so I'm going to grab whatever that one is. Again, those things all correspond to whatever this is and whatever we put here. Okay, so now what we're going to see is actually just the title or the actual data that's coming through there. We're going to save that, and we're going to refresh in here. I can resubmit it. Should be fine. And when I resubmit it, I see that ABC is coming through. And I'll go ahead and do 1, 2, 3 and whatever. All of that doesn't matter. So now we actually have that data coming through, and it's being validated by a built-in Django form. Okay, so of course I can actually use this data now to create our model, right? So I can actually come in here and say product.objects.create title equals to this data here. I'll go ahead and just call it the title from user or from input. Let's call it from input. I'll put it there, and we'll grab this thing, paste it here. Oops, paste it here, and then we go. So let's try this again. I'm going to actually re-navigate to that page, not refresh it, and I'll go ahead and say hello world, exclamation mark. We hit send. Now we go back into our Django admin. In this case, I now have 4 products, and one of them says hello world. Let's just try that again. Another try, and we hit send yet again, going back in here. And what do you know? We have another product in there. And you might be thinking, hey, we're probably done, right? That's good. I'm good. No worries. We now have a way to validate whether the form is happening, and I can create this data. This seems like a good enough view. Now, this is one of those things that, technically it's working. And in this case, it's actually working pretty securely, almost as securely as we can make it, with a couple major exceptions, one of them being we want HTTPS in production. But it's almost there. Unfortunately, it's not quite as good as we can make it. So the reason for this has to do with the fact that we've been, first off, using just standard HTML forms. We've been using our handwritten HTML forms. What happens if in here I decided to call this name instead of title? Well, now my HTML is broken, and we don't want to do that. And we also don't want to make too much work for ourselves at any given time. So instead, what we want to do is take this concept. I'm going to go ahead and copy it so I can leave it in there for your reference for later. If for some reason you are going to go back and look at that code in particular. And now what I'm going to do is actually get rid of, well, all of this. Okay. And now I'll go ahead and say form equals to, well, what was our form name? It was just product form. And in here, I'm going to go ahead and say request.post or none. Okay, so before we said request.post when the method was request.post, or with the request method equaling to post. That's when we actually handled this data, and that's perfectly fine. But if I actually bring this flag in, it means that if it's a GET request, it's not going to do anything about this form. If it's a POST request, it will do something about this form. It will actually try to validate it. And then I'm actually going to pass this in as a context variable. So now what I can do is actually use that context variable inside of our forms.html. So inside of here, I can get rid of my inputs. Everything else I want to keep, like I definitely want to keep my submit button. I want to keep my form element itself, the CSRF token, and I want to keep all of those things. And now I can do form.asP, so as a paragraph tag. So if I now look back in here and refresh, or actually let's navigate back, not refresh. Now it actually gives me a title tag in here, and my HTML that's rendered is quite a bit different. Right, so here it is. Here's that HTML that's rendered. Right, so we're still getting that CSRF token, or that middleware token itself, which that actual, this right here, all that's doing is rendering out this input type or that field. And now we have this paragraph or this p tag that actually handles our label and our input. Now, I mentioned that what if we actually change that title? Well, we come back in here and say ABC or whatever we want to call it. We refresh in this page. And now if we look at that HTML that's rendered, it is now called ABC. Okay, so that's really cool. But let's leave it in as title and go back into our view. So now what we want to do is actually handle this data. But before I do that, let's say, for instance, you forgot none, right? You forgot to say or none. You just said request post, and you went to one of these pages. Ooh, what's this? That's a validation error. This is saying, hey, you need to make sure that this field is coming through. So that, of course, is a default feature from Django. This is at least giving us some sort of warning that you didn't actually fill out this form correctly. Where this old method, and especially hard coding your HTML inputs, is not going to give you that. It's just gonna, say nothing unless you have to hard code it then for all sorts of like conditional statements, and it just starts getting really murky. This makes it really easy. So coming back to saying or none is perfectly acceptable. Something else you might see too, another method to handle this is just to initialize a form like this and then say if request.method equals to post, then actually handling that data as well. So you come in here and say, request.post. This is valid, but as you see, it's 3 lines to accomplish roughly the exact same thing, right? So let's leave it back to what that 1 line was. Okay, so now that we've got that, we can again say if form.isValid. Now, before I even run that or change or save anything, this is not a valid form. So this is a validation error that's coming up. A very important thing that we will discuss in just a moment. But anyway, so if I say if it's valid, then now again I can say print the form.cleaned data. So clean data is the actual validated data. We can still print out request.post, but request.post itself is not validated data. Clean data is validated data. So just keep that in mind. Now, validated data means that it's getting rid of things that may or may not be in there that we don't want. So always use clean data. These are both dictionaries. So as you saw before, I was able to get the field itself from that. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this just like that. And we'll come back into this create method. And again, I'll go ahead and say, now it's awesome. Now I'm not actually saving this in the database. All I'm doing is printing it out. So if we look in here, we see now a dictionary in here on how we handle it. Notice that it's no longer a list. It's straight up a dictionary that we can use. So one of the cool things about this now is I can actually do products.objects.create and literally unpacking that form data. So data equals to this clean data here. And I can unpack it using keyword args unpacking. So there's 2 stars and data. So that will actually pass all of that data in as keyword arguments into this create method here. So I can send it again. And oops, products is not defined. Yes, that is a silly mistake. Let's put it back to being product.objects.create because that's the name of the model, of course. So let's go ahead and send that again. Send it again, send it again. What's happening? Well, if I go back into my products here, I refresh. Hey, what do you know? I got a bunch of new products saying now it's awesome. Okay, so no surprise there. So that also means that, yeah, we were able to actually create new objects of this product. So typically what you would actually want to do is just reinitialize that form. So you would come in here and say form equals to product form. So this would actually reinitialize it. So the form is valid. So then the return method will have a clean product form itself. Another option is to return a HTTP response redirect to a different page like success. Okay, so that's one option. I'll show you how to import that in just a moment. As well as this one, you can also do just redirect. That is a shortcut option. So how do you actually import these 2 things? HTTP is the first one, so you can say HTTP response redirect. That's how you import that one. And this simply redirect. They do roughly the same thing. There are some features that redirect has that HTTP response redirect doesn't by default. But that's how you would actually redirect the page if you wanted to. In my case, I'm just going to render out a plain form. Okay, so there is one way to actually, well, kind of skip these few steps. Well, maybe not the form part, but this right here. We can actually combine these into one step by using a different kind of form. In fact, we can actually not even need to declare the title itself. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this one out now, put in a new product form, and I'll do from.models. We're going to go ahead and import our product model. And there's another thing called a model form. So the model form actually allows me to declare a model itself. So we say class meta and the model equals to the model for or the product itself. And then we can declare which fields in here we actually want to render out in this form. So this class meta is basically telling the model form itself, hey, this is how we're going to describe everything else. So I can actually still use these fields in here. That's perfectly acceptable. In fact, you can use these fields to override what's ever coming in by default here. That is not something I'm going to be doing at this point, but it is pretty cool that you can still override fields in there. So if I save this now and come back into this view, notice everything was named the same. It just made it a little bit simpler for me. I can actually come in here and I'm still seeing this title. So technically speaking, all of this is working identical here, right? So it's getting that form clean data. It's really not doing a whole lot to this. So what I can actually do is, again, get rid of that stuff. And I can actually say obj equals to form.save and commit equals to false. So what this is doing is it's actually giving me an instance of the product model itself. It's just not saved in the database yet. So I can actually do some stuff and then save it. So then just call obj.save. Now, of course, you're a beginner. You're probably like, well, what kind of stuff am I wanting to do here? Well, perhaps I would do obj.user equals to request.user. So this is something we'll cover in the future, but it is really nice to see that I just kind of shortcutted creating the object this way, or even initializing an object. So product and data. So essentially this right here is equivalent to product data. And I would recommend that you test that out if that's like, what the heck is that, right? Definitely test it out on your own because it is important to see how these things work on your own, right? So create a dictionary, run this stuff in the Python managed shell, and test it out. So these two lines actually augment or circumvent the need for these two, right? And this is actually also building towards class-based views, class-based generic views on using this product form. I'm actually going to change it to being called product model form so that you know for sure that it is a model form versus just a standard Django form, because both of them are really, really good and really useful depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Now, there is one thing that I did mention that we haven't covered yet, and that was that validation. Notice that I had that validation error before, so now I want to do that same thing, but I want to validate what's in this title. But before I validate what's in that title, I'm also going to add in that content, field itself, and just show you, hey, look how simple it is to add in that content field. I realize, like, from a CSS and like a pretty standpoint, it's not pretty, but it certainly works. Anyway, so now I've got this, I'm going to go ahead and validate this title. So to validate this title, there's a few different ways on how we can do it, but I'm going to show you the easiest way. So it's just clean underscore and then the field that we want to validate. So if the field is title, we validate with title. If it's content, it's content. It's pretty much any of your model fields, so anything in here, but it's also any of the fields that you declare up here. So if you were to add additional fields on there, this clean method will actually handle that. So it takes in self, and to get this data, we just do self.cleaned data.get. Actually, let's clean out the title itself. Okay, so the data itself .get .title. Much like in our validation method that we were doing when we were actually grabbing that data before, this right here, right? So cleaned data is the part that we're looking for, what we're interested in. And this method is actually called before, or actually works before and while you use this isValid method. So when you call isValid, it actually calls all of your clean data methods here. So what we want to do is we're going to end up returning what that data is. Right, so whatever that data is, that's what we're going to return. And here what I'm going to do is say if the length of that data is less than, 4, then I'm going to go ahead and say raise forms.validation error. This is not long enough. Okay, so we save that and we come back in here. I'll go ahead and do hit send data. This is not long enough. So it's now giving me this validation error. I think that's pretty cool, right? So I could do that same thing for content, right? So I do content in here, save that, and go back to create, and actually write an A. Doesn't matter what the title is. I hit send data, and I get product form not defined. Okay, so that's a couple issues here. So one of them being this clean data here. I should call this content. The other one being inside of the view. Maybe you caught this, maybe not. Was actually how this part renders out. So a couple little errors there that, hey, you know what? That happens. So let's go back in here and type something out, and I'll type A in content. I hit send data. This is not long enough. If I go into the admin itself, I do have one gibberish one. That was the error that I had just a moment ago. It did save that data. But what we also do not see is if I continue to send this data, it actually does not send to the database. So that's an important aspect of doing validation on any given field. Now, this gets to a little bit more advanced territory, but you can use custom validators directly on any of your model fields. You can also use them directly on fields here as well. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because every field itself has its own custom validation, right? So this character field right here will not be able to be longer than 220 characters, right? So if it's longer than that, it will raise a validation, assuming you're using the model form, you know, our product model form, and you're actually storing that data like this. So this will actually validate and make sure that all of that is accurate and cleaned and ready to be saved. So that is a lot of those security features, and that is Django Forms. Now, I realized like I probably just floored you on how quickly all of these things happened. A big part of the reason for that is, number one, I wanted to make sure that you did understand all of it from the get-go. I didn't want to just jump in and show you how to do model forms. I think it's important that you know how not to use storing data that you can get from somewhere else, whether it's actually this way or this bad way. But I really wanted to move up and help you understand where this comes from and why it's really important to use Django Forms, because of how much feature and functionality and security is built into using standard Django Forms. Because as soon as you start working with users, that's when you're going to start hitting some really challenging things. So like it always happens whenever you hit users. That's when things always break. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and jump in to some questions. Hopefully you have a bunch. I do want to mention several things that make forms even easier, but I'll save that for questions if you have them. So let me just get this all queued up over here. And there we are. And let's see. Okay. Just give me 1 second, guys. I appreciate all of the questions from a little while ago. So ask your questions now related to what it is that we're talking about here. I'm going to be on for maybe about 10 minutes, so all of these go about an hour long. Okay. So here's a good question. So how can we use Bootstrap styles in forms? There's a couple ways to do this. In the field itself, I will tell you that you should check out the references because I'm not going to write it right now. But the field itself, right here, you can actually declare attributes and add a HTML class in here. That is actually a way that I recommend that you learn how to do. There is another package. I think someone mentioned it on the chat. There is another package that's called Django Crispy Forms that also makes that a lot easier. But unfortunately, you are at the whim of Django Crispy Forms as how fast they adopt whatever's new for frameworks. So actually writing the CSS class itself inside of the field is my preferred method. But there's like a lot of customizations that go on there, so I don't want to confuse you more than I maybe already have. Thanks for the question. So, yeah, so this goes along the lines of that same thing. How do you add CSS to the templates after using extends base? This is actually maybe going back a little bit to what we did before. with templates, but I'll go ahead and show you now because I think that's still relevant to many of you, especially given what we just did. So what we see here, this is base.html, right? So we had this style tag here. What you can actually do is add your own style tag here. So you can say block styles, something like that. Or you can add a block head tag. So head and add in block. I would actually probably say using blockhead is probably a blockhead is probably a better method. And then inside of any of your templates, you can come in here and now use that style tag and style it however you want, if you want to do inline styles. In the long run, I don't recommend doing inline styles. In the long run, I recommend creating your own style sheets and then referencing those things when you need. But just adding that template tag in there is a really simple way to do that. Good question. Hopefully that helps. That also should alert you to the fact there is one more thing I just wanted to mention, that when you actually do go into one of these pages, if you inspect the element here, these do have their own IDs, right? So there's a class for error list, right, itself, and then each field has an ID as well, right? So you can use CSS selectors to style any given ID also. And it's typically ID underscore. That's how Django works. And that's another thing that you can absolutely customize, but it's just not something that happens by default. So yeah, styling is a major thing, especially when you look at just generally how ugly plain HTML can be. Yeah, cool. How do you handle multiple forms from a single view? So there are ways to do this, but I actually wouldn't recommend handling multiple forms on a single view. Instead, what I would do is have one form that gets all the fields that you want, and then handle that data afterwards, after it's validated and whatnot. So there is the other method is to change the action for any given form and have that action being called to the view that actually handles the form with some sort of response. You can also do JavaScript enabled forms using AJAX, so asynchronous JavaScript requests. It's just like, I don't like what reason would you need multiple forms in one single view? If it's to add a bunch of data, there's also something called a form wizard and form sets. So form sets are allowing you to add a bunch of data at once, but it's a lot more complicated than just standard forms. So now that you know standard forms, you could probably handle multiple forms in one single view. But if it's like the product model itself, and then you want to have a profile model also in there for some reason, what you would do is just create one big form, a standard Django form, or even a model form, and then just add additional fields as you need them. Good question. How to avoid saving the same data multiple times. So yeah, this, I mean, I think I just showed you how to do this. Essentially, you need to render a new form after the data is saved rather. So you create a new instance of that form and you render out that form on the view itself. That will avoid the duplication itself. There are other ways to make that even more robust, but for the vast majority of forms, that should work, with the exception of somebody hitting send data multiple times. It might actually initialize that. So another thing that you could potentially do is adding session variables, so using request sessions. So yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for that. Maybe I need to cover that in another time. Yeah, so this is a good one. So in form.save, what is commit equals to false. So it's a capital F false, as in a Python false. So if we look at this, what that's doing is this right here. That is actually saying, hey, don't save it to the database. If you do want to just save it, you can run form.save, and that will actually save it into the database. You don't actually need to do those things. So this means commit equals to true, right? It's the same thing, and it actually gives you back an object or an instance of the product model form class. So this is committing it or saving it in the database itself. Good question. Let's go ahead and comment those things out and leave it how I left it. All right. Okay. This is how to do this on class-based views. That is a good question outside the context of this Q&A part, because I only have a few minutes left. But essentially, you would use the product model form in a generic class-based create view. That's just generally speaking how you would do it. There are a lot of things in the documentation that cover that. And if you want to know about classes, I have a lot of that on my website, so cfe.sh, and look up the project class-based views unleashed. I definitely cover that in a lot of other projects as well, but that one specifically will show you how to do that. But I think the documentation on Django is pretty good as well. How do you refresh a page after a given time using a view? Yeah, so I think the best way to do this actually is using JavaScript, because Django itself, after it renders the view, Django's like, I'm just going to wait until you do something else, right? That's essentially what's happening here. Django sends its response from any given request. Django's job is done. So that's where JavaScript is actually really important of a front end like augmentation. So when you want to add additional user interface type things, JavaScript really comes in, and you can have JavaScript refresh that page as much as you want. Django itself would not be able to initialize that on its own, unfortunately. Maybe at some point in the future, but think about it this way. If you send a letter through the post, through the mail, once you actually put it in the post office box, your job's done. Django's very similar to that. Django's almost like sending that letter back. You can't do anything now. It's not until the mailman might be able to do something. So think of the mailman as JavaScript in this point, where the mailman goes and delivers that letter. That's probably not the greatest analogy, but the idea is, as soon as you render a template, you can't really do anything with that template without using something like JavaScript to handle that. And that's also true if you're using a mobile application. So if you're using Swift or Java in iOS or Android, those things would actually have to do that refresh as well, not Django. So Django would be able to provide data there, but it won't actually be able to actually manipulate things on that site. Yeah, thanks for the question. Did you mention the exclude parameter in the meta class of a form? Yes, this is in the documentation, and definitely not something you're going to want to do very often. So notice that I actually declared something called fields. These are all the fields that I want to render. There is another way to actually do this, and that is just saying exclude, and you want to list out the ones you want to exclude. Let's say, for instance, price. These two things will render the exact same thing, but unfortunately, this is not good practice at all. A big part of the reason is that if you sent this to me without this field in here and just forms.py, and you're like, hey, something's going on with my validation, I don't understand why, I would say to you, well, I only know of this one single field. Whereas if you used and explicitly declared what fields you want to use, then I'll see, oh, these are the fields that you're using, and yeah, this is where the validation problem is. But if you only use exclude, you could have like 100 fields here, and I would have no way of knowing that. So that is one of those best practices things that I want to emphasize. Exclude can be useful in some cases. I mean, in all honesty, you could do it this way, where it's incredibly explicit, where it's showing me the fields that are included, and it's also showing me the ones that are excluded. So this is even better, so that I don't even have to go to models.py to see what's going on with those fields. But I think this part is quite a bit redundant, and it's not something we need as long as we declare fields. But I will say that model form itself will tell you, hey, you need to declare one of these two lists. If you don't declare them, it's just not going to work. Really good question. Thank you for that. I'm assuming maybe you were looking at the documentation, or you saw somewhere else they used exclude. I do not recommend using exclude. I think I just laid it out pretty well as to why. Thank you for that. How to work with UTF-8. My Russian named products are shown as decoded strings. Yeah, so this is a really good question for Stack Overflow. Search on there to figure out exactly how to use your specific kind of encoding. And a lot of times it's actually declaring the encoding on top of forms.py. Yeah, so that encoding characters and the different languages is incredibly frustrating for everyone involved. I think while you're learning, given that it is in Russian, I think maybe trying your best to use just English strings for now as you're learning, and then worry about decoding and encoding things in the future. Thanks for the question. Sorry, that's not probably the best answer, the one that you're looking for, but that's the best I've got for now. Let's see here. So I am only going to be on for maybe another couple minutes, but I will say, hey, thanks to Sumit for the super chat. I appreciate it. Every little thing helps. I mean, even like if it's 40 rupees or $1, whatever it is, that always helps and it moves everything forward. So thank you for that, you guys. So if you like this boot camp, obviously, like, I would love it if you just watched all of the ads, and I don't care if you watch the ads. Turn off the ad blocker, but the super chats certainly help keep things going. Or if you really want to invest in yourself and support everything that I do, just sign up for my website. That's another cool thing that you can do. Not to make this whole thing a sales thing. I was actually doing something, and that's decided what I talked about. Anyways, here we go. Django forms are great in my opinion, better than Flask's WTF. And that, I'm going blank on what WTF standard for, but those are Flask's third-party forms. Now, I actually agree with you that Django forms are a lot easier to use than third-party packages in Flask. This is one of those batteries included. This is one of those huge benefits of using Django itself, right? Django itself, they have an opinion on how you should actually send data to Django. And if you've been on any of my live Q&As, you'll know that one of the things that I really want to see happen with Django is much like these forms, but also for requests related to REST APIs at some point. But yeah, Flask WTF, those forms are also really good for Flask. It's just not as full featured as Django is by default, but they do a lot of the same things. So I do appreciate that. That statement there. I was very fast today with coding. Try to slow it down. Totally understand. I only allotted an hour for this, and there was just a lot to cover and a lot to unpack for Django forms. Really couldn't go much slower than that. Sorry about that. I mean, if I did, it would have stretched out forms to multiple days, which it definitely could have, but we only have 10 days to build a single page product e-commerce thing. So I really want to get the foundations down as much as possible. I totally anticipate a lot of you are going to have to re-watch this one to really fully get everything that's going on here. So thanks for bearing with me on the speed. And I know you probably couldn't even keep up with the coding, I would imagine. So yeah. Here's one. When am I going to start using users with forms? That will come. I think I'm going to be covering authentication tomorrow. Don't quote me on that for sure, but I think that's what I'm going to be doing because it's actually really important to be able to use users as another built-in security feature for Django. I think auth will be coming tomorrow, which I'll show you in that how to actually use the users with forms. Auth itself, now that we understand forms a little bit, we will be using forms again then. And so even if it didn't all sink in yet, authentication requires forms. You actually need to enter information on there and hopefully securely. Thanks for the question. Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Please activate substitutes. What does that mean? I have no idea what you mean by activate substitutes. Should we use class-based views raw rather than generic class-based views? So I definitely need to cover in detail on YouTube class-based views for sure, and I intend to do that. Class-based views, if you understand how to do them, generic class-based views is amazing. It's really, really easy to do things. But if you don't understand how to do them, using the raw class-based view or just the base class-based view is the method to do it. That's how you will start to understand it yourself. So thanks for the question. So you hope in the future you'll explain how to implement CSS and Bootstrap. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I actually have a video on YouTube somewhere that shows you how to do this related specifically to Bootstrap. I know that for sure. The method of using crispy forms as well as integrating Bootstrap the hard way, I guess, using Django specifically without crispy forms, hasn't changed much in like 5 years. So keep that in mind too. Django forms haven't changed much in 5 years too. There are some features that have come out that are really cool, but you know, I didn't want to overload you way too much. Well, so we've got a lot of really good questions. Are we done? Yes, just about done. I'm going to answer a few more questions here. Sorry if I didn't get to your questions. I can only answer so many. These live Q&As, when I do only questions, some of you already know this, I am I'm totally using a whole hour just to answer questions that are coming up here. And even then, I don't get all of them. Will I cover deployment? I cover deployment a lot. And will it happen in the bootcamp itself? Probably not, because there's just so much to cover. However, I do hope that we get there. It really depends on how tomorrow goes and how early next week goes, because there's a number of things that need to be covered for us to actually handle a single page e-commerce. So we will see. We will see. Yeah. And if I do, I will eventually cover deployment. I will say that much, right? So related to this code, all of that will eventually be on YouTube or some sort of live streaming event. So I absolutely will be covering deployment in some form. Will it happen within the next week and a half? Not necessarily, right? Okay, so yeah. Add a PayPal donation. Interesting. That's a good idea. I'm assuming that you mean on my website. Yeah, thanks, David. I will. I'll probably do that. I do appreciate you saying that. Of course, you can always enroll and get a membership, as somebody mentioned before. But perhaps a donation button would be awesome as well. I thought about doing a Patreon and stuff, but I've heard a lot of issues with Patreon, and since I'm a software developer, it's kind of weird to be like, oh, go to my Patreon and not just to my website, because yeah, I think that's probably makes sense to most of you. Anyways, this is the longest day we've gone. We've gone almost 10 minutes over the time that I intended to do. So anyways, thanks so much for watching, everyone. Hopefully you got a lot out of this, and thanks for bearing with me on the speed. I know I covered a lot, but it's definitely worth it if you go back and just learn as much as you can about Django Forms, because they are all very, very good. So yeah, thanks again, guys. Oh, the website link. Thanks. That's a good question. Right here. So just cfe.sh without the YouTube. That is my website. So it's also codingforentrepreneurs.com, but this is significantly easier to write, don't you think? Especially for many of us who didn't remember or don't remember how to spell entrepreneur every time. I totally do that still to this day, but I remember when I was first learning it, I kept on messing it up. But anyways, yeah, cfe.sh. Thanks again, guys. I'll see you next time, tomorrow, same time. That's 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. California time is an easy way to think of that. That's GMT -7. It's really impossible for me to give you all of the potential time zones. So I will schedule it on YouTube, and that should actually appear in your specific time zone. I'll schedule that here in maybe like 10 minutes or so. So thanks again, guys.